The night was warm, the way October nights in South Louisiana are warm, still carrying the heat of summer in the air after dark. The smell of the bayou moving through the open windows of 2nd Calvary Baptist Church, the sound of cicadas underneath everything else. On the evening of October 4th, 1963, James Arsenault had stayed after the others left to lock up the church himself, the way he always did. He was the last one out. He was never seen alive again. His car was found the following morning on a dirt road off Cane Mill Road, 3 miles from the church, driver's door standing open, engine off. His briefcase was on the passenger seat. His hat was on the dashboard. Whatever had happened to James Arsenault had happened fast enough that he had not had time to take his hat with him. The Calvert Parish Sheriff's Office opened an investigation that lasted 6 weeks and concluded that James Arsenault had, in the words of the official report filed in November 1963, come to harm through circumstances of his own making. No suspect was charged. No arrest was made. The case was closed before Thanksgiving. The people who had known James Arsenault, who had sat in his classroom, who had sung under his direction, who had stood beside him at the voter registration table in the back room of the church, knew what those 6 words meant. And they knew what the closed case meant, and they knew that in Calvert Parish, Louisiana, in the autumn of 1963, there was no appeal available to them. They waited. 61 years is a long time to wait. But the truth that James Arsenault's community held for all of it was not lost. It was passed down. It was kept. And in a sealed glass jar in the back of an old mortuary on Pellerin Street, it was preserved. Before we get to the jar, before we get to Ernest Fontenot's handwriting on the note wrapped around it, and what the FBI found when they finally looked, we have to go back to who James Arsenault was. Because the man who locked up that church on the night of October 4th, 1963, was not a symbol and not a headline. He was a person, specific and complete, who had spent his life building something in a place that was determined to deny him the right to build it. And to understand what was taken from Calvert Parish that night, you first have to understand who it was that they lost. Calvert, Louisiana sat in the low country of the Atchafalaya Basin in the southern part of the state. A parish town of about 8,000 people divided, as all towns in Louisiana were divided in 1963, into a world, and a world within the world. On the white side of Calvert, there was a courthouse, and a bank, and a diner, and a chamber of commerce. On the black side of Calvert, there was everything that had been built in the space that remained. A cluster of shotgun houses, and a general store, and a beauty parlor, and 2 churches, and, at the center of it, the Galvez Colored School, which had been teaching the children of Calvert's black community since 1921 in a building that had not been painted since 1948 and received the textbooks the white school discarded. James Arsenault had been teaching music at Galvez since 1952. He was 38 years old in October 1963, a tall man with a patient manner and a baritone voice that his students would describe, decades later, with a particular precision of memory that belongs to the things that matter most. He had grown up 40 miles away in Iberville Parish, had gone to Southern University in Baton Rouge, had come to Calvert for the job, and had stayed because the community needed what he had to give, and he knew it. And that was enough reason for a man like James Arsenault. He taught general music and choir to every student at Galvez from 5th grade through senior year. His classroom had 3 working instruments, and a piano that was missing 2 keys, and a collection of records he played on a portable turntable to show his students what music could sound like when it was given room to breathe. His students learned to read music in a room where the ceiling leaked when it rained. They went to state competition in 1959 and placed 2nd. James Arsenault told them they would come back. On Sunday mornings, he directed the choir at 2nd Calvary Baptist Church, where he was also a deacon and where in 1963 he had begun helping to organize a quiet, careful voter registration effort for the members of his community. He did not make speeches about it. He did not put himself in front of cameras. He sat with people at the table in the back room of the church and helped them fill out the registration forms and explained, gently and specifically, what the process was and what they were entitled to and what it meant to try. His wife, Della, knew what he was doing and had told him twice to be careful. He had told her he was always careful. He was the kind of man who meant that as a description of method, not a promise of safety. He had 3 children: Robert, 14, Luella, 11, Clarence, 7. Robert played trumpet in his father's class. Luella sang soprano in his church choir. Clarence was too young for either, and spent Sunday mornings drawing in the margins of the church bulletin, while his father's voice filled the room above him. On the evening of October 4th, 1963, James Arsenault kissed Della goodbye at 6:30 p.m. and drove to the church for a voter registration meeting. He told her he'd be home by 9. He was never home again. Della Arsenault called the Calvert Parish Sheriff's Office the following morning after the car was found. She spoke with a deputy named Gerald Thoreau, nephew of the sitting sheriff, who took her information and told her someone would be in touch. Someone was in touch 3 days later when a search party organized by 2nd Calvary Baptist, men from the church who had gone into the low country along Cane Mill Road themselves, found James Arsenault's remains in the Atchafalaya Marsh, a mile and a half from where his car had been left. The official cause of death was recorded as drowning. The official investigation, conducted by the Calvert Parish Sheriff's Office without assistance from the state police, lasted 6 weeks. Sheriff Eldon Thoreau, Gerald's uncle, interviewed 4 people. He did not interview any of the men who had been at the voter registration meeting on the night of October 4th. He did not request assistance from the FBI. He noted in his final report that James Arsenault had been engaged in outside agitation activities and concluded that he had come to harm through circumstances of his own making. He closed the case on November 14th, 1963. 14 days after the assassination of President Kennedy had pushed every other story off the front pages of every newspaper in the country. The people of Calvert's black community knew the name of the man who had done it. They had known it within a week. The name was Clyde Bergeron, 22 years old, the eldest son of Raymond Bergeron, who owned the largest cotton warehouse in Calvert Parish. Clyde had been present at a white citizens' council meeting the week before James Arsenault disappeared, at which, according to people in the room who would not speak publicly for decades, James Arsenault had been named as someone who needed to be dealt with. Clyde had made clear, in the way that young men in 1963 Louisiana made certain things clear, that he was willing to deal with it. The people who knew said nothing publicly. They were not cowards. They were people who understood, with the precision of lived experience, what happened to black residents of Calvert Parish who named white men in accusations of violence. There had been examples. The examples were recent. But one man in Calvert was in a position to act without speaking. Ernest Fontenot was the proprietor of Fontenot's funeral home on Pellerin Street, the only black-owned funeral home in the parish, and the establishment to which the Arsenault family had brought James's remains for preparation. Ernest Fontenot was 51 years old in 1963, a careful and deliberate man who had been preparing the dead of Calvert's black community for 20 years, and who understood, when he examined James Arsenault, that the official cause of death was wrong. James Arsenault had not drowned. The evidence of what had actually happened to him was present on his body, and it was not consistent with drowning. And Ernest Fontenot was not a forensic pathologist, but he was a man who had seen what bodies looked like after water and what bodies looked like after other things, and he knew which one he was looking at. He could not go to the sheriff. He could not go to the state. He could not file a complaint or demand a second autopsy or do any of the things that would have required a system to respond to him, as though his word was as valuable as a white man's word. What he could do was this. He preserved what he found. He sealed it in a glass jar. He wrapped a note around it in his handwriting, rubber banded to the glass, and he wrote on the note, James Arsenault, October 1963. Keep this safe. Someone will need it someday. He put the jar on a shelf in the back room of his mortuary, behind the supply cabinet, where it remained for the next 56 years. Every story on this channel is built from real records and real people who deserved better than what they received. If this work matters to you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And now, let's go back to Calvert. Ernest Fontenot died in 1989. His mortuary passed to his son, who ran it until 2011. By 2019, the building had been vacant for 8 years, and Ernest's grandson, Marcus Fontenot, had driven down from Shreveport to begin the process of clearing it out. He was 34 years old. He knew the broad outlines of the Arsenault case. It was a name in the family, the way certain names are in families that have witnessed things they cannot forget. But he did not know what his grandfather had kept, or where. He found the jar on a November afternoon, behind the supply cabinet, on a shelf that had not been opened in years. The rubber band had long since dried and crumbled. The note was still legible in his grandfather's handwriting. Marcus Fontenot read it twice. Then he took a photograph of it with his phone. Then he put the jar in a box and drove it to Baton Rouge and called the FBI field office. The FBI's Civil Rights Cold Cases Unit had been established under federal legislation passed in 2008, specifically to investigate unsolved murders from the Civil Rights era. They accepted the Arsenault case in January 2020. Special Agent Pauline Tron was assigned as lead. She requested the original parish sheriff's file, what remained of it, and reviewed what there was to review, which was not much. She reviewed the 1963 report. She noted the 6-week investigation and the 4 interviews. She noted the name of the sheriff who had signed off on it. She also reviewed Marcus Fontenot's jar. The biological material Ernest Fontenot had preserved in 1963 was analyzed by a forensic laboratory contracted by the FBI. Despite 6 decades, the sample was sufficient for DNA extraction, a result that the laboratory's lead analyst described as extraordinary, attributable to the sealed conditions in which the jar had been stored and to the particular care with which it had been prepared. The DNA profile was uploaded to genealogical databases in the spring of 2021. By the summer of 2021, the tree had converged on a family with deep roots in Calvert Parish. In the autumn of 2021, it had a name. Special Agent Tron flew to Calvert in October 2021. She drove past the courthouse. She drove past the site of the old Galvez Colored School, which had been demolished in 1971 when the parish finally desegregated. She drove past First Baptist Church on Main Street, where a sign outside announced the upcoming harvest dinner and listed the deacons of the congregation, and where the third name on the list was Clyde Bergeron. He was 80 years old. He was still in Calvert. The investigation that followed took 2 years. The FBI corroborated the DNA evidence through documentary records, property records, Witness accounts collected from people now in their 70s, 80s, and 90s who had spent 60 years holding what they knew and were now willing, finally, to say it on the record. An elderly woman in Baton Rouge, 91 years old, a former resident of Calvert, confirmed that she had heard Clyde Bergeron speak in the days following James Arsenault's disappearance, in terms that left no doubt about his involvement. She had told no one at the time. She told the FBI everything now, and she wept while she was telling it, not from grief alone, but from the specific exhaustion of having carried something for 60 years and feeling it finally leave her hands. Clyde Bergeron was 82 years old when federal agents arrived at his house in Calvert on the morning of March 11, 2024. He had spent 6 decades as a man whose worst act was also his most protected secret. He had sold farm equipment for 30 years. He had been a deacon at First Baptist since 1991. He had been the Lions Club president in 1998. His name was on a bench at the public park on the corner of Main and Cypress, placed there in 2015 in recognition of his community service. He had given the invocation at the Calvert Parish High School graduation in 2019. He opened the door in a cardigan. He looked at the badges. He said nothing. He was placed under arrest on charges of civil rights violations resulting in death, a federal charge that carries no statute of limitations. When the arrest was announced, the reaction in Calvert was not uniform. It was not simple. In the white community, in the churches and the civic organizations and the families who had known Clyde Bergeron as a neighbor and a deacon and a Lions Club president, the response was shock. Disbelief, denial, in some quarters, that lasted for weeks. A man they had known their whole lives, a man who had sat in a pew, a man whose name was on a bench in the black community of Calvert, in the families who had descended from the congregation of 2nd Calvary Baptist, from the students of Galvez Colored School, from the people who had stood in the back room of a church in 1963 and tried to register to vote. The response was different. It was not surprise. It had never been a mystery to them. What it was, instead, was the strange and complicated feeling of waiting for 61 years and then watching the world finally move. Robert Arsenault was 75 years old when Special Agent Tran called him at his home in Baton Rouge to tell him that a federal arrest had been made. He had been 14 when his father disappeared. He had grown up and become a high school music teacher himself. He had taught in Baton Rouge for 38 years and had retired in 2012 and had thought, in the years since, that the call he was waiting for would probably not come before he died. He was wrong. He called his sister Luella, 72, in Baton Rouge. He called his brother Clarence, 68, in Houston. The 3 of them spoke for 2 hours. Luella said later that they mostly talked about their father, things they remembered, things they wished they had asked him when they still could. She said they talked about his voice. She said she could still hear it. James Arsenault was 38 years old on the evening of October 4, 1963. He had stayed after the others left to lock up the church himself, the way he always did. He was a patient man with a baritone voice and a classroom with 3 working instruments and a piano missing 2 keys. And he believed with the full and non-negotiable conviction of a man who spent his life acting on what he believed, that every person in his community had the right to vote, and that his job was to help them get there, and that the risk attached to that belief was one he had calculated and accepted and carried alongside everything else he carried. He was right about the right. He was right about the risk. He was killed for being right about both. Ernest Fontenot put a jar on a shelf in 1963 and wrote on a note that someone would need it someday. He died in 1989 without seeing the day arrive. His grandson found it 30 years later, and carried it to Baton Rouge in a box in the back of his car. And the FBI took it, and a laboratory extracted from it what Ernest Fontenot had known it contained. And 61 years after a sheriff closed a case in 6 weeks without interviewing a witness, a federal agent knocked on a door in Calvert. The bench with Clyde Bergeron's name was removed from the public park in April 2024, 3 weeks after the arrest. The city council voted to do it quietly, without a statement. The vote was unanimous. Robert and Luella and Clarence Arsenault attended a memorial service at 2nd Calvary Baptist Church in May 2024, organized by the congregation that had waited alongside their family for 61 years. Robert was asked to speak. He said that his father had died believing the work mattered, and that the work had mattered, and that he wanted people to understand that his father had not been a victim who happened to be brave. He had been a man who understood exactly what he was doing, and had done it anyway, every week, in the back room of the church, with patience and without performance, because it was the right thing to do and he was the person who could do it. He said he locked up the church that night because he was the last one out. That was who he was. He stayed until the work was done. There are questions this case does not resolve. Clyde Bergeron is 82 years old, and whatever the federal process produces, it will not return 61 years to the Arsenault family. It will not give Della Arsenault, who died in 2001, the verdict she spent 38 years waiting for. It will not give back what was taken on a warm October night in 1963. How do we measure justice when the system that failed in 1963 is the same system now offering an arrest 61 years later? What do we owe the Ernest Fontenots of the world, the people who preserved the truth in a jar and trusted that someone would eventually come looking? And for the communities that knew for 6 decades, who held the name and the knowledge and had nowhere to bring it, what does it feel like when the world finally catches up to what you have always known? James Arsenault locked up the church because he was the last one out. That is who he was. He stayed until the work was done. 61 years later, so did Ernest Fontenot. Justice moves slowly toward the people who deserve it fastest. Stories like James Arsenault's are why this channel exists. If you believe that no one should be left waiting, subscribe. More cases are in the description below. Thank you for being here.